Hey students, this is Professor Gore. This is part two of the recorded lecture on kind of like the road to the Civil War. So like the sectional crisis that takes place in the 1840s and 1850s in American history. So in part one, we ended with this slide talking about Zachary Taylor winning as a war hero in the election of 1848 against Lewis Cass, the Democrats, and Martin Van Buren of the Free Soil Party. So if you remember at the very end, the Free Soil Party actually emerged because of the issue of slavery and expanding to the territory of the American Southwest. So um, they really opposed slavery's expansion into these new territory. So the thing that's going to forever change really the course of California, particularly for Native Americans, but also just for the United States as a whole, is that gold is discovered at Sutter's Mill in 1848. And so really, it's kind of unique to American history that this idea of this gold rush, where you can go out and mine an area, and anything that you in your mining claim that you acquire is yours to keep. You think about world history, it would have been the king or the emperors or the rulers' gold and so forth if that would have been brought about. This particular case, if you own the land claim or the mining claim, then it was yours to keep. And so you have this mass migration, about 250,000 residents coming across the Great Plains and crossing over the Rockies to get to California, or they went by boat to Central America, crossed over, like, say, Panama, Guatemala, Nicaragua area, caught another ship, and then sailed up that way, or they sailed from the East Coast all the way around the coast of South America up to the West Coast. And it's kind of a fascinating event in American history. And my high school AP U.S. history students, we would watch a video on the California Gold Rush. Um, but since I have you guys do your 3 film assignments, I'm not going to add a fourth one in there about the California Gold Rush, but it is fascinating. And so you can see right here from this map, all these different major gold mines that are taking place are all along kind of rivers and streams and so forth. You can see almost all of them are along streams. Um, some gold is discovered in streams, but really the majority of the gold is going to be in the heart of the mountain, which is much more difficult to mine, and really where you start seeing massive amounts of minerals extracted is where you start seeing corporate mining that takes place in the latter half of the 1800s into the early 1900s and all the way to present day. And U.S. history too, we talk about some of the labor unrest, and miners were some of the biggest people that had kind of unrest with working conditions. And their work conditions were terrible. So if you look right here, these are 2 pictures of miners, but really the wealth that was created was people who mined the miners. And what does that mean? That actually means that people who would create stores to sell mining equipment, guidebooks on mining and so forth. A lot of people went out there, had no idea what they're doing. And people who just sold stuff, gear and all kinds of junk to the miners are the ones who really made wealthy. I mean, Wells Fargo Bank is one of the largest banks in the United States, and they started in San Francisco around the time of the gold rush, loaning money and so forth. So it forever changed the course of American history, and for the Native Americans in California, it was devastating. Their remaining land that the Spanish hadn't taken are consumed by Americans coming out there with greed for the gold rush, and there was even at one point in certain areas there were kind of lawless areas where a Native American scalp would have fetched a reward. If that sounds horrible, it is. So anyway, this is San Francisco merges as this large city. Within about 10 years, San Francisco goes from just a small coastal town to one of the top 10 largest cities in the United States in terms of population. It's going to be the center of immigration coming from really the West. What I mean by the West, I'm talking about the eastern part of Asia. So tons of Chinese migrants, Japanese, Koreans, Filipinos, that they're going to come to the West Coast of the United States in American history. It's not as large as the amount of immigrants going to come through New York or even Boston or some of those areas, but it's still an incredible immigration center in American history. So what ends up happening is because California fills up so rapidly with population in 1849 because of the California Gold Rush, um, there becomes a debate. All right, so California wants to enter the Union as a state in 1850. Well, people didn't realize that California became a state that rapidly because of the massive amounts of population movement over there, and so there became a debate: should California be a slave or free state? Now, at this time, the vast majority of Californians don't want it to be a slave state. You know why? Because they don't want slave labor to compete for them for mining in 1850 out there. And so it sets off this huge debate in American history in Congress. And so you kind of the three major power players are Daniel Webster, who's on the left, the yellow circles around him. Henry Clay is the guy standing in the middle. And then John Calhoun is the one who's kind of got the reddish circle around him. And these guys were famous politicians. Henry Clay and John Calhoun kind of got started as young men in the War of 1812 as war hawks. Daniel Webster kind of comes on the scene in the 1830s in the Jacksonian era. And all three of these men end up, I believe, passing away in the 1850s. But Henry Clay had kind of come out of retirement. He had kind of was going to retire from his congressional seat after he had been beaten in 1844 for the presidency by James K. Polk. He kind of was going to retire to his homestead in Kentucky. But he comes out of retirement. The Great Compromise he came up with, the Compromise of 1820, or the Missouri Compromise, and also this compromise bill in the Jacksonian era dealing with the South Carolina nullification crisis. He's going to come out of retirement for make one more compromise in American history. And at this point, a lot of my students in my high school class over the years have always like, Mr. Gore, when is Henry Clay going to die? Well, he dies in 18, so he is done. All right. So the South wanted California to become a slave state. You know why? Because they knew tremendous power and commerce that could emerge out of there. They South threatened to secede from the U.S. if they weren't allowed to expand slavery there. And what you'll end up having is an issue that emerges. So Daniel Webster, famous Whig politician, is also kind of seen as a compromiser. He kind of gave a great oratorial explanation with the nullification crisis in the 1830s with Andrew Jackson as president. He's going to argue against Calhoun. And they kind of battled out. And then Henry Clay, who's also a slave owner, is going to kind of be the guy in the middle who's going to work out a compromise. So let's look at what the Compromise of 1850 consisted of and what it led to, because it's going to have big time implications in American history. You want to definitely know the Compromise of 1850. It is highly likely that your quiz will have a question from it, because there's a bunch of questions in the test banks and so forth that I give you guys for this particular chapter. And then also it'll certainly be on your test. So make sure that you are ready to rock and roll for the Compromise of 1850. Okay. So it's going to consist of 5 parts. Okay. The 2 of them are going to benefit the North. Okay. 2 are going to benefit the South. It is a compromise. And one of them is unrelated to the North or the South. It just deals with Texas. All right, so let's look at what the North is going to get. Okay, so first, the North is going to have it where California is going to be meant as a free state. No slavery in California. Okay, California does not fight for the Confederacy during the American Civil War. Okay, now number 2 has nothing to do with the North or the South. It really just deals with Texas. If you remember, I told you there was a big chunk of land that were extended into New Mexico and Colorado that Texas really claimed there really wasn't any Texans living out there. They decide to give that up in exchange for the U.S. government taking over their debts. So it's kind of be like your parents taking over your credit card debt that you've accumulated for 9 years, which is what Texas had when they were an independent republic. And so that's done with Texas. Okay. Now, South is going to get a new fugitive slave law. So this is the first thing they get, that basically made it where you could be in prison if you aided and abetted a runaway slave. You could be fined if you don't help capture a runaway slave if it runs away on your property, whatever. This is going to anger the North, but it was a compromise that they were willing to give in. So this benefits the South. The 4th thing, this benefits the North, is the slave trade in Washington, D.C. is completely abolished. It was a look really bad in terms of public relations at that time. You got to look at today. Today would be a scandal of astronomical proportions. But they were actually trading slaves in Washington, D.C., which is bordered by Maryland, Virginia, which are slave states, and had there wasn't a whole lot, but there still was slave auctions that took place in the nation's capital. And so slave trade is completely abolished in Washington, D.C. So that benefits the North. So the North gets California as a free state, and slave trade is abolished in D.C. All right, the last one is benefits the South is any new state that is brought into the Union from the land acquired in the Mexican War or Mexican-American War is now going to have the ability to determine via popular vote whether they become a slave state or a free state. So let's say New Mexico voted to become a slave state by popular sovereignty or just voters, and then Arizona voted to become a free state. They have the legal right to do that. So that benefits the South. So at least it opens up the possibility of slavery being in those new areas when they became states. Now, they don't become states until after the American Civil War, but that was what they were pushing for. So let's recap. All right, two things that benefit the North are California is a free state, and slave trade is abolished in Washington, D.C. All right, two things that benefit the South are a stricter fugitive slave law, okay, and popular sovereignty in new territories acquired in the Mexican War. And then the fifth thing deals with Texas. Texas gave up some land claims in exchange for the federal government taking over its debts that they had acquired while it was an independent country. All right. So Daniel Webster gave his famous 7th of March speech in favor of this new fugitive slave law. So this is one thing he compromised on because he didn't really support it personally, but he did support it to get it passed because he's looking to compromise. Here's O. Henry Clay at the end of his life, actually taking a picture of him. Normally he's painted. And so my students were like, this guy would be great at Halloween. Now, Zachary Taylor originally vetoed it. He didn't like it. But Zachary Taylor, who was elected in 1848, inaugurated in 1849, dies in 1850, 1851 time period. His vice president, Millard Fillmore, one of the most forgotten American presidents in U.S. history, ended up passing it when it was passed again. And so if it wasn't for Zachary Taylor's death happening, chances are it would not have gotten passed. And Zachary Taylor was a slave owner from Louisiana. All right, so once this happens, you're going to see that the steamroller is going to start happening to the American Civil War. So by far the most controversial aspect is that Northerners are ticked off that this Fugitive Slave Act is put into place. The South's not happy about it because they didn't get as much they want. The North is certainly upset about it. And free blacks and abolitionists openly resist the law. So as slave catchers traveled northern states to try to capture potential runaway slaves, oftentimes abolitionists would run them out of town. Now, you do have cases where free blacks who were legally free were wrongfully captured and put into slavery. And that happens if you ever seen the movie 12 Years a Slave, a true story about this man who was tricked and drugged and forced into slavery in the South for about 12 or 13 years. And it's either 12 or 13 years a slave. I can't remember. It's been a long time since I've seen the movie. But he eventually, a friend of his who was kind of an abolitionist in the North ends up getting him released. And he gets to go back to his family, but he's missed a lot of his children's lives growing up. It's sad story. But unfortunately, it's a true story in American history. So anyway, California becomes a state in 1850. Utah Territory, New Mexico Territory, none of those are states yet. Now there's Oregon. And then a lot of the Great Plains states are not states yet. So anyway, this popular sovereignty decided that you could vote on something. So it was seen as democratic, okay, but it's still, yet again, kicking the can down the road on the issue of slavery. So at this point, abolition has really starting to risen in American history, and the Second Great Awakening has really influenced that. And particularly Northerners are really starting to see that slavery is morally wrong. And one of the books that really moved and motivated people was what's called Uncle Tom's Cabin, one of the most widely read books in the mid-1800s, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was actually an abolitionist. And so in this book, she writes the story of what happens to kind of this fictional story, but it really catches at Americans' emotions. It was really denounced in the South because they hated it because it made slavery look terrible. But the worst part about it that really drew at Americans' emotions was the part about the selling off of family members. That just, that I think that's probably one of the most crushing things about slavery. You can deal with physical abuse and so forth, but when you lose loved ones, that is what really tugs at you psychologically and so forth. The Underground Railroad is going to increase as more and more people are willing to help runaway slaves. Abolitionists refuse to abide by the fugitive slave law, so Southerners are angered about it. They're more distrustful of the Northerners. Northerners are more distrustful of these Southerners, and it's just going to kind of compound on each other. So this is quotes from about the Compromise of 1850, and particularly the Fugitive Slave Act. So this is Emerson and William Lloyd Garrison. Emerson, remember, famous transcendentalist. William Lloyd Garrison, the most well-known abolitionist in the United States. So if you would like, you can read this later. So Southerners get upset about it. They threaten secession and war, and they believe that it should be enforced because of the Fifth Amendment that protects private property, and the supremacy clause that the federal government is supreme over state and local laws and so forth. And yet they're going to argue that state laws should supersede federal laws and all this other stuff. But it is hypocritical. But here is Harriet Beecher Stowe, who is the author of the famous book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And so as you see from the Compromise of 1850 until 1860, each year more and more Northerners began to view slavery as immoral. And some of them more and more are going to start viewing slavery as worth fighting against. So of all the reform movements that we talked about in Module 3, abolition is the one that's going to kind of one up all of them. And of course, it gets accomplished in 1865 with the Civil War and the 15th Amendment. Now, this one is an interesting work. It's called The Impending Crisis of the South. Now, this guy is not in favor of slavery, but besides rocking an amazing beard at that time, he is going to argue against necessarily slavery from a completely different perspective, and from a Southern perspective. He argued that the reason why we should get rid of slavery is because it really hurt poor white yeoman farmers. Okay, so he's not arguing it from the moral argument like abolitionists in the North. He's arguing it from an economic perspective from white Southern yeoman farmers. Okay, so if you want to know how slavery expands, you got to understand that it's going to happen because of old-fashioned reproduction, and then the tremendous demand for cotton cultivation. So I've shown you a similar map. I want to show this again to illustrate this. You see a lot of gaps where there's not cotton cultivation. Partly is because the land, like the mountains of North Carolina, can't really grow cotton, or the mountains of Tennessee or northern Alabama and Georgia. But you see big gaps because of where the Cherokee reside. The Choctaw, Chickasaw of Mississippi, the Creeks in Alabama, the Seminoles in Florida. And then you look at it in 1860. Boom. Okay. That's how much cotton has grown. And you see this big, huge, dark area on the border of Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi. And that's where you have some of the greatest concentrations of wealth in the United States. And there was more millionaires that lived in Manchester, Mississippi, which would have been a town right there on the Mississippi River, in that big engulfed area. And what's crazy is that down there in far south east Arkansas, actually not too far from where my dad was born, my dad grew up on a really poor farm in Eudora, Arkansas, until he was about 4, and then they moved into Pine Bluff, Whitehall area. But that Chillicothe County down there was like the wealthiest county before the Civil War. Now it's one of the poorest, if not the poorest, in the state of Arkansas. But that was all before the American Civil War. And so cotton cultivation goes from this to this. So as you can imagine, that is going to lead to the tremendous growth of slavery. So you look at the slave population, say, you look at 1820. Okay, so let's backtrack here. Cotton cultivation. Cotton wasn't the only crop that slaves worked on, but you look at it, goes from, okay, so you can see the amount of slaves, boom, by 1860. And that's because of a tremendous amount of cotton cultivation. Other crops as well, but cotton is going to be the biggest moneymaker. Okay. Now, so an election of, you see the two political presidential elections in the 1850s is basically just full of compromise candidates. Nobody any special. Not that great. Now, Franklin Pierce, you can't really tell from this picture, but they called him Handsome Frank. He was a good-looking guy for that day and age. He was a troubled man, and I do tend to feel bad for the guy because he lost a child in a, excuse me, I think I can't remember if it was a train accident or a horse carriage accident, but it drove him to alcoholism and depression, and just really struggled losing a son. So anyway, but the Democrats choose Franklin Pierce. Southern Whigs couldn't support him. Winfield Scott, hero of the Mexican War, runs. The Whig vote kind of gets split, and Winfield Scott's kind of one of the only war heroes in American history to lose a presidential election. Franklin Pierce, the Democrats won't even select him in 1856. He's not that big of a deal of a president. One of the things, though, that some slave owners, these wealthy plantation owners, majority of Americans and the majority of Southerners didn't really care about this. They wanted to expand slavery, and they had kind of envisioned what happened in Texas to basically have since there was going to be limiting of Southern states with the Combines of 1850, they thought, well, what if we had new slave states in Central or South America or the Caribbean? And so one kind of aggressive Southerner actually gets imprisoned and dies trying to lead to a revolution in Honduras and Nicaragua, either Honduras or Nicaragua, to expand slavery down there. And these attempts failed miserably, but they were trying to. And Cuba was still part of Spain's. In fact, the United States is going to fight the Spanish-American War that we'll cover in U.S. history too about it. Well, it's actually because Cuban nationalists are going to be trying to fight against Spanish rule and so forth, and we helped them get their independence. But anyway, this Austin Manifesto was an attempt by even Franklin Pierce, a Democrat, to acquire Cuba from Spain. Doesn't happen. Free soilers in Congress are like, no, you're not going to do this. So they block vote in Congress, and it doesn't get passed. So Austin Manifesto, Southern's attempt to try to acquire territory in Latin America to attempt to expand slavery, particularly Cuba, Nicaragua, and Honduras as well, but especially Cuba. Free soilers, stop it. Okay, so you might want to take notes on that, highlight that, star that. Okay. Now, also one thing to kind of show the growth of sectionalism that takes place in the 1850s. Sectionalism was already occurring before this, but the 1850s speeded up. And it's really the development of railroads. Now, obviously slavery and the kind of the cash crop economy in the South, but if you look at the amount of railroads that are constructed in the Midwest and the Northeast, the North is by far going to have the majority of railroad tracks, and that's going to give them a clear advantage in the American Civil War. And really, you start seeing trains being built or train tracks being laid in 1840s, but 1850s is a big decade for train tracks. And then right after the American Civil War in the late 1860s into the 1870s, we just get on a railroad building boom in American history until the Panic of 1873 sets in. So a famous congressman at this time is named Stephen Douglas. We won't hear about him after the American Civil War because he dies, I believe, from a horse carriage accident during the war. But he was a famous congressman from the state of Illinois, a Democrat. And he thought the way to handle this issue of slavery is just, all right, well, let's let the people decide. Because he knew that the majority of the people in the country, overall population, probably didn't support slavery and wouldn't have voted for it because they felt threatened by it economically. And so he thought, well, we'll just make popular sovereignty decide in a new state, because he thought that slavery would get voted down. That'll make the Southerners happy, at least it's possible. And but it'll vote it down. Well, this plan backfires. And so let's talk about the Kansas and Nebraska Act. Now, this is supposed to be Stephen Douglas, supposed to be like a Roman gladiator or something, pushing for expansion of popular sovereignty. So the future states of Kansas, Nebraska, they were part of the kind of Nebraska territory at this time. The issue was, okay, slavery, should that be allowed there? But really, the issue for Stephen Douglas is the Transcontinental Railroad. So since he was an Illinois senator, he beats Abraham Lincoln for the U.S. Senate in the 1850s. Lincoln beats him for the presidency, which is pretty cool. He wanted the Transcontinental Railroad to go from Chicago all the way to Sacramento, because anybody that had any sense knew that whatever main city the Transcontinental Railroad started out from is going to boom economically. And you look at Chicago today, because it eventually does get built from Chicago, but not until after the American Civil War. Chicago is the third largest city in the United States. It is a city of tremendous economic wealth and influence. You look at how many Fortune 500 companies in the Chicago metro area, it's nuts. And so one of the reasons why it takes off is its location and the building of the Transcontinental Railroad starting from there, and all these other railroads that connect to it, plus its connection to Lake Michigan by water. So some Southerners wanted to go from St. Louis, because Missouri, St. Louis would have been the most logical because it's right in the middle of the country, and it's an important port city on the Mississippi River. Some Southerners wanted to go from Memphis, so still kind of in the middle part of our country. And then some Southerners who were really pro-slavery, which is why they purchased the Gadsden Purchase in 1853, they wanted to go from New Orleans. Now that eventually is going to be one built from New Orleans, but that was not the logical solution. At least Chicago had connection to the Great Lakes. And so for infrastructure and commerce purposes, Chicago or St. Louis made the most sense. So Stephen Douglas proposes this Kansas-Nebraska Act that he thought would help deal with the issue of slavery, and it's like pouring gasoline on a fire. You don't do this. So here's what the proposal was. It's going to take away Native American rights in Nebraska Territory. So that's terrible for Native Americans. We'll see that conflict continue during and after the Civil War, and we'll cover that in the first part of U.S. history too. It does repeal the Missouri Compromise, a compromise that had worked for just over 30 years. And they basically decide that, all right, well, popular sovereignty is going to decide whether slavery exists in Kansas or Nebraska, where before the Missouri Compromise, Kansas and Nebraska would be off limits. Those would automatically be free states. And it's going to lead to bleeding Kansas. And some historians argue that the first shots of the American Civil War happened in Kansas and not in Fort Sumter in South Carolina. But anyway, just a matter of opinion, but bleeding Kansas is a terrible thing. It is a precursor to the American Civil War, one that you have to know. Okay, so what we covered so far, you're going to have to know the Compromise of 1850. Got to know it. You have to know the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and you have to know bleeding Kansas. It's just this conflict that emerges over the issue of slavery in Kansas, where people on both sides are killed, free and slave supporters. So what actually happens is they began Kansas was wanting to become a state in the 1850s, okay, in 1856 specifically. And so there was all these different elections that throughout the territory. Most people that lived in Kansas that were wanting to create a state were in the eastern part, closer to the Missouri border. And what happens is some kind of bit of controversy. You have Northerners who don't live in Kansas moving into Kansas to vote against slavery. They're abolitionists. And then you have pro-slave people that are coming from Missouri fleeing into Kansas to vote illegally. So you had all kind of illegal voting going on. Both sides claimed they won the election. The Confederacy claimed that, or not the Confederacy, but the pro-slavery side claimed they won the election. The anti-slavery side claims they won the election, and this basically Supreme Court has to get involved, and they rule in favor of that the abolitionist side won the election. There is violence that emerges. You have slave owners that are attacked by radical abolitionists. You have free soilers that are attacked by radical slave people. John Brown was the most infamous radical abolitionist, and we'll cover him in just a minute. But he and his sons massacred some slave-owning families at Potawatomi Creek in May of 1856. About 200 people are killed, estimated, and well over $1 million in property damage was done. And so this is a very interesting political cartoon. It's showing just a normal settler, and it looks like he's having a black person shoved down his throat, supposed to represent a slave, by these pro-slave people, like trying to make them, adopt slavery whether they liked it or not. And so bleeding Kansas is terrible. Not a shining moment in American history for sure, and it's going to be a precursor to what's going to happen in the early part of the 1860s. And so just making this political cartoon is ripping on the Democrats for supporting the Kansas-Nebraska Act and trying to force slavery down the throats of free soilers. So there was an abolitionist group called the New England Immigrant Aid Society, and they kind of represented the anti-slavery group. There was even an abolitionist that sent what they called Beecher's Bibles to Kansas, and what it was labeled was in these wooden crates that said Bibles on them. They were actually guns going to the abolitionist. And so Lawrence, Kansas becomes the capital, and Lecompton Constitution was this pro-slavery government that they try to form, and that the federal government declares illegitimate in Lecompton, Kansas. It gets rejected by Congress. It wasn't legitimate government. They lost the election, the slavery side, but they claimed that they won it. And anyway, so one of the things that you'll see is that this popular sovereignty jacks up the U.S. So where does the Republican Party get started at? So let's look at all this real quick. And so the Republican Party starts from the formation, kind of a hodgepodge of groups that form it in 1856 with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So there was a political party that's covered in your textbook called the Know Nothing Party. They were actually, they call themselves the American Party. They're opposed to immigrants. They're proud to be native-born Americans, and they really want to prevent these Irish and Germans from coming and so forth. The reason why they're called the Know Nothing Party is when they were asked about these secret meetings that they held, they were like, "Oh, I don't know anything." And so their critics called them, "Oh, well, you don't know nothing." So the Know Nothing Party. So some of them who had been in previous elections are now, they'd won some local elections, but never anything at the presidential level. Some of them became Republicans. Some of them became other things like Democrats or whatever. One of the things that some of the Whigs become, and really the former Whigs that are opposed to slavery make up a majority of the Republicans. Democrats who didn't like slavery. So there's one point that not everybody in the Democratic Party was opposed to, or was for slavery, like it is in the 1860 election, particularly when it splits. Free soilers became part of the Republicans. They felt like that they had to join forces to get more accomplished. And it is formed to stop the expansion of slavery. It's basically kind of like a new, bigger free soil party. And then some staunch abolitionists who wanted to abolish slavery now immediately. And so the Whigs, they're over the course of the next 4 years are going to disintegrate because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And just like the Federalists were demised because of the War of 1812, and by 1820 they're done. The Whigs are going to be the same. 1860 was the last time they had a presidential candidate, and you don't hear of the Whigs anymore in American history. The Republicans are going to kind of rise really quickly. They select John Fremont as their presidential candidate in 56, and then Abraham Lincoln in 1860, and they win with Lincoln. And so this American or Know Nothing Party, they emerged because of they don't like Catholics, particularly Irish and Germans that are coming over, and just anti-immigrants at this time. So in 1856, the Democrats win with a compromise guy by the name of James Buchanan. He is ranked by most historians as the worst president in American history. And he deserves that title. He basically does nothing for 4 years. Even when the South secedes, he's like, "Oh, well, that sucks. I don't have any power to stop that." And so when Lincoln comes in office, he goes, "I hope that you're as anxious and excited about this office as I am to leave it." So he's kind of worthless as a president for 4 years. And one of the things he does do is unconstitutional. He tried to push the Supreme Court to rule in his view on the Dred Scott decision, which I'll cover in just a minute. So American Party splits over Bleeding Kansas, and Southern faction supported Whig Millard Fillmore. If you remember him, he'd been president after Zachary Taylor died in the early 1850s. The Northern faction supports the Republicans, so they split over the issue of slavery. So the American or Know Nothing Party is going to be done by 1860. And so anyway, the Republicans don't win by any means, but they look like that they're becoming a legitimate party. Now, the Dred Scott case, we've had some well-known and infamous, these bad Supreme Court cases in American history. The Dred Scott case is probably considered one of the top 3 worst Supreme Court decisions in American history. And really, in fact, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roger Taney, kind of rules one of the most racist things said in American history, and at least from a government official, and he was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, but basically argued that this was a country for white people. only. And but what ends up happening, it's kind of an interesting story. Dred Scott was a literate African American man in the United States. And he had basically his slave owner had moved from Missouri to Illinois and later Minnesota. Well, Illinois and Minnesota were free states. And in some ways, he was treated kind of more of as a servant. He had a fairly decent relationship with the the man, not as much his wife. And so anyway, he was kind of considered. He was really considered a free man in Illinois and Minnesota. Worked for his former master, and then his master died, and he had moved to Missouri with his family. He was married with kids, and the former master's wife wanted to claim him as a slave. He's like, no. And so he sues, thinking, because he's an educated man, that he was going to win. He's like, "This is legitimate. I lived in Illinois and Minnesota. Those are free states." And so what ends up happening is the Supreme Court surprisingly does not rule in his favor. And what they say is one of the most ridiculous things the Supreme Court's ever put out in American history. They say that as a slave, he is not a citizen, therefore has no legal rights in the court system. Okay, let that sink in for a second. So as a slave, he is not a citizen, has no legal rights or legal protection in the court system. Secondly, the Supreme Court does something that really was not what this case is dealing with, but they made it about this case, and that is they declared the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. That, well, if Dred Scott's master wants to take him as a slave into Illinois, it's just like bringing his horse. So they declared that you could basically have slavery in any northern state. So tremendous controversy. Southerners are like, yeah, they love it. That are at least the slave owners, and then the Northerners, and particularly the abolitionists, are just about to throw up with sickness that this court case was passed. Now, James Buchanan, really the only thing he does in his 4 years is that he pressures Roger B. Taney and the Supreme Court to make a pro-Southern ruling to try to keep the peace. It just pours more gasoline on the already ensuing. So anyway, it's terrible. And it's not viewed today as a good Supreme Court decision. So anyway, this is a quote from Roger B. Taney. He said, "They had slaves for more than a century before being regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. This opinion was at that time fixed and universal in the civilized portion of the white race." That comes from the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And he was actually appointed by Andrew Jackson, which I think was actually one of the worst things Andrew Jackson did, was appoint this guy. All right, so let's look at Abraham Lincoln. So Lincoln runs for the U.S. Senate in 1858. Even though he loses, it helps propel him to the presidency later because he makes a name for himself. He was kind of an unknown guy in the House of Representatives when the Mexican War broke out in 1846, and he becomes a more well-known guy because of the Senate race. Now he loses, but a lot of his, what he says and so forth in these debates with Stephen Douglas that kind of puts him on the map, and the Republicans select him as their candidate in 1860. Now, in fact, if you guys have been in debate in high school, one of the debate styles is a Lincoln-Douglas style debate. That's how interesting that these debates were in 1858. And this is where Lincoln says his famous quote, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. Either become one or the other." He's talking about slave or free. And Lincoln said he opposed the spread of slavery. Okay, didn't say that it should be abolished or anything like that. And he's eventually going to change his mind about halfway through the Civil War about the issue of slavery. So anyway, Lincoln and Douglas square off debates, and it's famous. And you can read this quote where he says, saying they're not equal to white people, but they're entitled to the same laws and so forth. This was kind of a compromise politician thing to stay in 1858. So Lincoln advocated economic opportunity for free blacks, but not equal political rights. He wasn't willing to make that stand yet. Now he will towards the end of the Civil War. So anyway, here's Lincoln in 1858, and here's Stephen Douglas. Okay. Now, in 1859, crazy thing happens. John Brown and his sons, along with some other free blacks, try to instigate a slave revolt by they're hoping they can capture weapons at a U.S. armory in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which is now part of West Virginia today, because West Virginia becomes a state in 1863 by not wanting to secede with the rest of Virginia. And so they had hoped that once they acquired these weapons, and they thought they were going to acquire them from the town very easily, that they would kind of create this mountain hideout, and all these runaway slaves would flee to their cause. They would arm them, and they could succeed. So John Brown is kind of one of those just radical guys in American history. At times abolitionists praise him as almost like a Moses type figure. Slave owners viewed him as almost like the Antichrist or something. I mean, he is very much hated by pro-slavery people and beloved by more radical abolitionists. So what ends up happening is they raid Harper's Ferry armory there. It's where kind of like a military arsenal of weapons is kept for the U.S. military. They expect that the town's not going to resist about this, but the town actually start realizing, well, these guys are breaking into the armory. They start shooting at them. And so it pins them into the armory, and then the U.S. Marines are called, and it's actually led by future Confederate General Robert E. Lee to capture Brown. One of Brown's sons just killed, and a few others, and then Lee and the Marines are able to capture John Brown. And it's kind of interesting. And so this painting is of John Brown kissing a African-American baby as he's walking out to the gallows. And so this is a pro-abolitionist painting here, that he's got this big flowing beard, almost supposed to look like a Moses type figure, and it was intended that way. But if you've seen see a pro-slavery painting, it look like a crazy madman. So he is found guilty of treason, which he did commit treason by trying to attack a U.S. armory, and he is hung. And so a lot of the Southerners feared that all Northern abolitionists were like this, and they began acting even more so like they have a chip on their shoulder. And so when you have this guy who's opposed to the expansion of slavery win the presidential election in 1860, Southerners were like, all right, well, at least the planters were like, we're gonna secede from the Union. So here's another one. Is he a martyr or a madman? This is a painting of John Brown. And this is from Harriet Tubman. It's a quote. Harriet Tubman was a famous woman who led quite a few to safety on the Underground Railroad. And this is what she said about John Brown. I've been studying and studying upon it, and it's clear to me it wasn't John Brown that died on that gallows. When I think how he gave up his life for our people and how he never flinched, but was so brave in the end, it's clear to me it wasn't a moral man, it was God in him. So they kind of abolitionists make John Brown out to be more than what he was. And then slave owners make John Brown out to be more than what he was. And that shows you how much of an issue that slavery was by 1859. And anyway, this is Abraham Lincoln, what he said about him. The Brown affair and its philosophy corresponds with the many attempts related in history as the assassination of kings and emperors. An enthusiast broods over the oppression of a people until he fancies himself commissioned by heaven to liberate them. He ventures the attempt which ends in little else than his own execution. Okay, so election of 1860. The Democratic Party splits. And so because Stephen Douglas gets exposed in the Senate candidacy in 1858 by Lincoln as being kind of a fence rider on the issue of slavery, basically would talk against slavery when he was speaking to Northern crowds. But when he speaks to Southern crowds, he would talk in favor of slavery. And really, he was a traditional politician of that day and age that would kind of say whatever he thought would get him elected. Not all politicians were like that, certainly at that day and age, but he was, kind of considered the figurehead of the biggest that would do that. So the Democrats don't trust him. They leave the Democratic National Convention. They create a new candidate by the name of John C. Breckinridge, Southern Democrat. The Northern Democrats select Stephen Douglas. John Bell becomes a nominee for a constitutional union party. It's kind of like some former Whigs and so forth that make up him. He's kind of considered a compromise candidate. And then Lincoln is a Republican candidate. Now, if you'd have combined Stephen Douglas and John C. Breckinridge votes, the Democrats would have easily beat the Republicans. They weren't as large and widespread this time. But typically in American history, when a major political party splits its votes, the other party wins. And that's what happens in the election of 1860. And so when Lincoln gets elected, South Carolina announces in 1860 they're going to secede from the Union. In fact, they even rejoice, thinking, "Oh, Lincoln got elected. It gives an excuse to secede," and they're followed by 6 other states. Okay, now eventually 4 other states are going to join with them to create 11, but Originally, it was just 7. So when they decided to vote to secede, you can kind of see from this map what areas voted against it and what areas voted for it. South Carolina was really the only state in the Union that did not have a Union brigade or regiment that formed during the Civil War that fought for the Union. Every other southern state had people that fought for the Union at some point, particularly mountainous areas like northern Alabama, eastern Tennessee, western North Carolina, northern Arkansas. Mountainous areas didn't have slaves traditionally, and you look at West Virginia, it's the whole state's pretty much mountainous. They broke away from Virginia because they didn't support secession and the Confederacy. And so, anyway, but we will cover that when we get to the American Civil War lecture. So the first time when the original 7 states seceded, they created their capital at Montgomery, Alabama. Once Virginia, which was the largest southern state in terms of population and had one of the few industry centers in Richmond in the Confederacy, they moved it to Richmond, which was about 90 miles or so from DC. So it was very close to the Union capital. So anyway, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia are going to secede as well. When Lincoln gets inaugurated, he wants to preserve the Union. And that's really the reason why that they say that the Civil War was first waged, was to preserve the Union. Later, it becomes over the issue of slavery. But the reason why the last 4 states secede, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, well, Delaware didn't really consider it, but the other 3 considered it, was when Lincoln asked for every state to provide militiamen to bring the other 7 states back to the Union. And these states decided, no, that's gone too far. We can't take up arms against our southern brethren, and we need to secede from the Union. Had those 4 states not seceded, particularly Virginia and Tennessee as well, the Confederacy would have not fought all the way to 1865. If they wouldn't have had Virginia, there's no way. They would have had the men or the material to do so. But they secede, and it forever changes the course of American history.